Hey everybody, Dr. Mike here. This is part 2 of my series of videos on the Korg Wavestate. I'd like to apologize for part 2 taking quite a bit longer than I expected, but when I moved away from the general overview of the Wavestate that we had in part 1, I realized that to go deep into editing was going to be a little bit problematic for a one-camera shoot. The Wavestate is designed with a very clear division between the stuff you do when you're playing it live and the stuff you do when you're programming it in depth. When you're playing live, you have all the controls that we showed in part 1. The mod knobs, all the controls for grabbing items quickly in the wave sequence lanes, filter controls, effects controls, LFOs, and so on. When you program a wave sequence, which is where we're going to be starting our look at the architecture of the Wavestate, everything is done on the display. You use the standard cursor controls and knobs, and the wave sequence lanes section is used pretty much just to select where you're working at any given time, with a couple of extra functions that are needed in real-time performance brought out onto knobs. What that means is, if I'm going to film this on a single camera and avoid stuff like picture-in-picture or split screens that tend to confuse people more than help them, I have to start by showing you where the various relevant controls are, and then dive in close so you can see exactly what's going on the relevant parts of the Wavestate. So, what do we have to work with here? For the wave sequencing part of this tutorial, we're not going to look at these controls at all. They're only for controlling the parts of the architecture that are above the wave sequence itself. The wave sequence is treated as an oscillator, and this is filters, envelopes, and so on. We're also only going to touch once in a while on the mod knobs. They do work with wave sequencing in real time, but when we're talking about programming and creating wave sequences and understanding what goes into a wave sequence, they're really not that useful. The other thing, which we'll be using every once in a while, are these buttons down here. These are used, if you remember, either to select programs in a set list, or in this case, to select steps in a wave sequence that we're working on. Now, you'll notice that anything past step 8 doesn't light up. That's because I've created a tutorial wave sequence patch which only has 8 steps. Anything more than that is going to get really confusing really fast. And that, by the way, is the hallmark of working with wave sequencing. You got to take it slow, and you've got to be careful until you really know your way around the system, because this is a very deep form of oscillator control that's way more complicated than the original wave sequencing that came out in the Korg Wavestation in the 1990s. So, when we work on wave sequencing, just to remind you, we choose our steps down here. We use the mod knobs sometimes, but the main part of the work we're going to be doing is watching the display while we have cursor control, value control, and choosing the parts of the wave sequence that we're working on at any given time. When we come back, which for me will be a few minutes of resetting the camera, but for you will only be a few seconds through the magic of video editing, we're going to dive in and get to work on Wave Sequencing 2.0. Okay, here we are back again, focused in on the part of the Wavestate that we're interested in. Now, this wave sequence tutorial patch that I've created is designed to be educational, not musical. The stuff that I'm going to be doing is not exactly the sort of thing that you're going to put on your next hit record, but it's going to be very easy to hear the effect of each type of wave sequencing lane, and then later on, you'll be able to hear how they interact with one another. For this first part of our wave sequencing tutorial, we're going to start with the basics. We're going to look at each one of the lanes, and then we're going to talk about how looping control works. Now, a good part of the sonic complexity is found here, but the nice thing about the Wavestate is it's pretty easy to see and hear where you are at any given moment, thanks to this graphic display over here. Now, let's talk about what these symbols mean. You'll notice that for each lane, you can highlight what you're working on. Right now, we've highlighted the master lane, but the highlighting moves as we jump between the others. You will also notice these graphics over here, the little triangles, squares, and dots. When these get moving in actual real-time play, they look really confusing. But for purposes of programming, it's actually great because you can see exactly what you're doing and where you are. Now, let's select the timing lane. As you can see, it has 8 steps. The square indicates the end step. Those triangles indicate where the loop begins and where the loop ends. So if we take the start and stop knobs, watch what happens to the graphic. You can see the loop end moves and indicates where it is. Step 8, 7, 6, 5, and so on. Now at the same time, we can move the loop start. Now you'll notice that even as we move the loop control, there's a triangle that stays on step 1. That indicates that the wave sequence itself starts on step 1. You may wonder, why would you ever want to move the start of a wave sequence? Which you do, by the way, by holding the Shift key and turning this knob, which is indicated to be start. The reason you do that is because there will be times when you're going to want to isolate certain parts of a wave sequence and not use them in a patch. Rather than have to go back and delete the stuff you're not using, those Shift start and end commands let you focus in on the parts of the wave sequence that are working right, so you don't have to go back and clear what you've been doing, even though there are utilities which allow you to do that fairly straightforwardly. In our next video, I'm going to do a deep dive into each one of the wave sequence lanes. I'm going to talk about their particular parameters, how they work, and how you can use them to customize the evolving timbres of the wave state. For right now, I'm going to show the global parameters that every lane has, talk a little bit about them, and then do a fast run-through of how these lanes and loops will sound in the tutorial before we get complex. For this quick run-through of the global functions, I've chosen the gate lane. That's because it's the simplest of all the lanes, and it's easy to see the global functions without being distracted by a bunch of other things. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that up here, we have a series of circles in the upper right corner of the display. That indicates that there are multiple pages in a given edit system. This first page has general parameters for the gate lane, and then you can use the Shift key and the left-right buttons to move to other pages. The first parameter here is a preset. Now, presets exist at all levels of the wavestate's architecture. It has a very large library of hundreds and hundreds of performances, patches, wave sequences, lane settings, and other things. The important thing to realize is that library allows you to browse through pre-existing bits and pieces, make use of them either directly or edited, and save them for use in other performances. However, you don't need to specifically and explicitly save each part of a performance. If you were to edit a preset and save a performance that used the edited preset in it, you wouldn't mess with what was in the library, but the performance would come up remembering all your edits. Basically what that means is if you're working on a particular performance, you never have to worry about saving the bits and pieces, nor do you have to worry about anything in the preset library being damaged by what you're doing. The next parameters are the start and end of the wave sequence lane and the start and end of the loop, which are controlled by the knobs, as you'd expect. The next parameter is repeats. Now, repeats are pretty straightforward. You might want a particular lane to only play once when you hit a note. in which case you would set repeats to off. You might want it to go multiple times. They allow you to select anywhere from 1 to 100 repeats. And if you set it to infinite, the lane will continue to play over and over again until you release the note. On the second page of parameters, the critical one here is probability. That's the probability that the step will actually activate. Now, for every lane other than timing, if you miss a step because it doesn't go off, the next step plays right away. For timing, it's a little different. If the probability is set for a particular step and that step doesn't play, the previous step extends through where the deleted step used to be. What that means is the timing lane's length doesn't change every time a probability setting causes a step to vanish. So, instead of a gap, you get a tie. Now, what we're going to do is go through some of these sounds, and you'll very easily be able to hear what each of these lanes is doing. Watch the display, and I'm going to select the various lanes, play them, describe what's going on, and mess with the looping a little bit. Now, the one lane that doesn't have all these parameters is the master lane. We'll be getting back to the master lane and talking about how it affects wave sequences in our next video. The important thing to remember is that the master lane is usually turned off, and when it's turned on, its effects are global over all the other lanes. For now, though, we're going to walk through the patch and very quickly hear what each lane does when we play with it. Now, this is a basic sine wave. It repeats once every second. You'll hear a click every second because the waveform is not resetting to 0. We haven't done anything to cause a smooth crossfade. Okay, pretty simple. Now, with the timing lane, we can actually change the timing of each of the steps. Right now, the way it's set is it's looping on that first step, which is only a second. But if we change the end of the loop so that now there are 2 steps, I happen to know that the second step is only half a second. So you get this. Now, if we go to the rest of the loop, what you will hear is a rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 1, 1. Get the idea? Now, we turn that back down and we go to the sample lane. The first step is that sine wave. But as we extend this loop, I have different samples set up for each step. So you'll hear 8 different sounds playing at the same pitch as we open up the loop. Yeah, we had to have lower at the end. I mean, it's a Korg synthesizer, right? Then we have the pitch lane, which causes, as you might gather, pitch offsets. So now we're back to our sine wave again, but the pitch loop has a step up on a major scale for each of the steps. So now the shape lane is interesting. Shape is a sort of global modulation that comes in a bunch of preset shapes, like envelopes, that can be applied to each step. They can be used to modulate other parameters. In this case, for the sake of simplicity, I've used the one global setting they have, which is to control the volume of each step. Now what I'm going to do is gradually turn it up, and you'll hear that we go from on and off to various waveforms, repeated shapes, hits, multiple ratchets, and things like that. So you see, we have triplets, rhythms, all kinds of things that can be applied pretty much anywhere. As I mentioned before, the gate lane is the simplest. It just controls the length of the notes, and right now it's 100%, but as we step through the loop, I've set the gate to gradually get shorter and shorter. Finally, there's the step sequencer lane. Now this one's tricky. It is another modulation source that allows you to control various modulation routings by adding a little something extra. You can put in a control signal from an LFO. You can use random sampling so that you have a slightly different value of a modulation on each step. It's not always easy to hear, and it's something which is going to be primarily used by more advanced programmers. What I've done here is to use it to control the cutoff and resonance of the filter. Now you'll notice that the 5th through 8th steps of that sequence were the same as the 1st through 4th. This can get pretty detailed, and so I decided to just use 4 steps. That brings us, by the way, to the last page of any given lane, which are lane utilities. This is where you can speed up your editing with some general actions that are similar to the sorts of things you might be familiar with from working with MIDI or audio software. You can cut out certain steps, copy or paste them. You can insert steps, and you can add steps to the end to make a sequence longer. Now, you can decide for each one whether you're doing it for just the lane you're currently on or for all lanes at once. And of course, down here, you can select your start and end steps depending on what you're doing. So now that you've heard what each lane is doing in our tutorial patch, now we can start playing with loops. As you know, each of our lanes has a different setting for each step. So what we're going to do now is start changing the relative loop lengths and where they start and stop, and you'll start to hear some of the possibilities of even a relatively simple wave sequence. You get the idea. Now you'll notice that when I changed the loop lengths, it caused the loops to reset wherever they were. It is possible to force the reset to all happen at the same time for all lanes. You can do that using the master lane. As I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video. Now, we've got all of these things going at once. Let's see what happens if we start to change the lengths and start and stops of the loops. And there we are back to where we started. Now, before we move on to our next video, there are some global editing and shortcut tricks that you have at the wave sequence level. First of all, if you press the wave sequence select button, it allows you to access certain global parameters for the entire wave sequence. Here you can select a preset. Again, remember what we said, that a wave sequence preset, when edited in a performance, is stored with that performance, so you don't have to worry about storing it elsewhere. Among the other functions we have available are a quick button to choose a preset for whatever lane you're on. Next up is a function called sync notes. It can be turned on and off from this page, or it can be quickly accessed by shift pressing the wave sequence key, which causes the sync notes light to come on so you know that it's there. Sync notes is very simple. It just determines whether a lane activates with each key on and that all notes run at different start points, or whether any notes that you play automatically get synced up to wherever the sequence is. So, with sync notes turned off, with sync notes turned on, this setting, Use Master, determines whether or not the master lane takes control over all the other lanes in the sequence. We'll be talking more about that, as I said, in the next part of this series. Next up is a function called Note Advance. When we turn it on, whatever lane we've selected will restart at the next step whenever you play a new note. Remember that we were playing the pitch lane, stepping up 4 times. Listen to what happens when we play a note over and over again. You can also cause steps to play in random order by shift pressing Note Advance to turn on the random order function. Loop mode selects whether you step through your loops in a particular direction after they play for the first time. So, when it's set to forward, when it's set to back and forth, and when it's set to backward, one last function worth mentioning is something called step solo mode. If you hold the enter button and select a wave sequence step, that lane, indicated by the flashing button here, will hold on that one step. You can then mess with it while other lanes are carrying on the way they normally would. So, for example, if we were to turn our initial patch back on with all of its regular settings, then we were to turn up various lanes and control their looping, like, say, this. We could then choose one particular sample step, for instance, and solo it so that now we can listen just to this one sample and mess with it while everything else goes forward the way it normally would. So what you're hearing is this one step focused on this sample control while everything else is going on in the background. It's a very handy way to determine whether the behavior you're getting on a particular step is what you want without a lot of distractions elsewhere in the programming process. That gets us to the end of this part of our tutorial series on the wave state. We've had a chance to look over the generalities of wave sequencing. Next time, we're going to go into the weeds as we explore the specific parameters of each lane and demonstrate how they affect what we do. Until then, please don't forget to like and subscribe this channel and head over to musicplayernetwork.com, where this and many more topics relating to keyboards and synthesis, as well as pro audio and other subjects, are discussed by an open and friendly community of professionals. In the meantime, until we meet again, remember to stay safe, stay sane, and stay connected.